going to go ahead and get started. I know that a few people will be trickling in from some of the other sessions that are wrapping up right now. Quickly want to introduce myself. My name is Lauren Carson. I'm the Executive Director at Black Girls Smile, Inc. So excited that you are joining us for day 3 of our Black Girls Are Magic conference. I am still floored at the speakers that we have confirmed. One of the speakers we have today, who I've been fangirling over literally since I had my son, and so many other amazing sessions. So Trina Greene Brown is recognized as an inspirational parent in 2018, by Kadri. Am I pronouncing that correctly? And as a Black feminist rising in 2017 by Black Women's Blueprint. Trina Greene Brown is a leader on the rise, and she's taking Black parents and children along with her to higher heights. Bridging her 15 years of professional experience as a youth organizer and ending violence with her personal role as a parent of 2 Black children, Trina Greene Brown is a proud Black feminist and mama activist. In 2016, she founded Parenting for Liberation as a virtual platform for Black parents, currently consisting of a blog, podcast, and in-person trainings and conferences. Trina has contributed to On Parenting for the Washington Post, and in 2019, her writing was featured in 2 anthologies, Chicana, Mother Work Anthropology centered on the intersection of motherhood and activism, and she is the author of Parenting for Liberation, a guide for raising Black children. It was published in June 2020 by Feminist Press. I am so excited to be talking to Trina Greene Brown for this amazing panel focusing on how we can raise free children.
Thank you, Lauren. Hi, everyone. Looking forward to being in this conversation with you all. And Lauren, appreciate you and your team for putting together this incredible conference this weekend and really honoring and centering Black girls and their mental health and wellness. So I'm really inspired by the work you do as well, because you are definitely supporting Black girls and being liberated and free. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's hop right in. I've read your book. I've sent it to like every one of my friends who has become a new parent. I'm like, we're all gonna parent for liberation. We're all gonna parent differently.
Oh,
so
thank you.
My first question is really centered around what made you first think about parenting for liberation or parenting differently in general?
You know, growing up, there was this thing my mom used to always say when I was like, what? And she'd say, parenting doesn't come with a manual. Like, we're just figuring it out. And so I was like, yeah. And then I became a parent. And then there were books. I was like, Mom, there's a whole set of books that you could buy, FYI. And so I was buying all of those books. And people, my elders in my community used to like make fun of me for like parenting by the book. And it was less about parenting by the book, but just like, I really believe that like someone has done this before, right? I believe that people know how to raise liberated children, or, I had seen children who were liberated, or that's what I was calling them. And I was like, they are, I love the way this person does this with their child. I love the way this person, so I was just like, I love the way some people were engaging with their children. And I was like, I wanted to learn their lessons, right? And honestly, to also just be transparent, since this is a safe space, I was not parenting for liberation in the beginning of my child's life. I was parenting from a place of fear. I was parenting from a sense of no. I was parenting from a place of protection, right? I was raising a Black boy. I am raising a Black boy. I do have a bonus starter now. But at the time when I was raising my son, I was just thinking about raising a Black boy who was cute at the time, but knew that once he got older, he wouldn't be cute anymore to certain people. I was raising him in South Central Los Angeles, which had all kind of other concerns. And then when we moved into the suburbs, then I was raising a Black boy who was one of the few in these schools. So I just had a lot of fear. And my fear led me to parent from trauma and do things that were not in alignment, raising my voice, yelling, even like utilizing any physical touch that was not loving touch, right? So I was not parenting in the way that was in alignment with my values, right? So I do social justice work. I'm an activist. I was working with young people. I was working at a youth violence prevention organization, right? So I'm working at schools and in community, holding adults accountable to like treating young people with respect and listening to their voice and letting them have agency, right? I'm like advocating for that in the world at schools. And then I have a child and I lose my sense of like liberation in my parenting. And so I said, okay, I kept feeling like there was a misalignment, you know? And so I was like, my spirit was unsettled and I said, I have to parent differently. I have to parent in the way that I advocate for the school and the community to lift up the students that I work with, right? And so I said, well, what would it look like if liberation and the work that I do could be centered in my parenting? And so that's how I got here. And I did that by asking a lot of questions. Sorry, you might hear my other child, aka the dog, who is like doing all kinds of things behind you, which is why I have the screen up. She's scratching. I'll take her collar off. I apologize, y'all. But so that's how I got here. That's how I got here.
Thank you so much for sharing. Usually my 19-month-old is like jumping in my lap, closing the screen. So just hearing is not that bad. I think what you say is so important. Like I said, I have a 19-month-old. I had him right before the pandemic. The majority of my parenting has been during the pandemic, which has been quite interesting. But I have to admit, like your book and the mindset that you emphasize in the book has been really helpful to me at many points. Especially, I think we have the health side of what's going on with the pandemic, but then we also have the race side as well. So that definitely, those two things kind of commingled with parenting is quite difficult. And I can think of one instance very specifically. We've kept my son home. He hasn't gone to daycare. So the only people he sees are me, his grandparents, and his dad. That's the only people he sees, really. And we had signed him up for Jamboree. And this was gonna be his first like big interaction with like other children. Granted, it ended up he was like only one of two kids that was at the Jamboree class. But the day before we were supposed to go to Jamboree, I was on Instagram and I saw another young Black mother talking about how she had taken her son to the park and he was running through the park. And 19 months old, they're off. Like we can't catch them, right? So her son is off running, and he goes up to a little white girl, and is just trying to play with her. And she runs over to her parents, and she says, "He's following me." And the parents come over to the mother and say, like, "Keep your son away from me. Keep your son away from our family. Keep your son away from our child." And when I read that, and at the end of it, she goes, "He's 2 years old." And I immediately like started crying. And I have to admit, when that happened, it didn't even happen to me. But in that moment, I was like, we're not going to Jamboree. Like, we're gonna go to the nicer area. We live in Atlanta. We're gonna go to the nicer area of Atlanta where the Jamboree is. If there's a white girl and he's never interacted with other children before, what is about to happen? I was like, we're not going. And then I thought back to your book and I remembered that how important it is and how much you highlight how important it is and the examples you provide of not parenting from a place of fear and parenting from a place of liberation. Obviously, I cannot sit by 19-month-old and explain everything to him, but remembering that mindset that you emphasize in the book was one of the things that was key to me switching my mindset in that moment and being like, no, I'm still gonna take him. I'm still gonna have him interact with the world, even if the world doesn't accept that or isn't nice to him. Like, I'm still going to approach my parenting and my interactions with my son and for my son from a place of liberation, of freedom, and not from this place of fear. And looking back on it, I can see so many times where I really see like my parents or my grandparents, that they had to parent at times from a place of fear, but that there's this ability to kind of make that switch. And can you talk a little bit more about why is it important? Why do you see it as essential to parent from a place of liberation and to navigate away from kind of these mindsets that we've had historically as Black parents?
Thank you for sharing that story, Lauren. And that when you shared the story of the other parent on Instagram, it broke my heart and it made me angry. And I'm like, okay, what do we do? The organizer of me was like, what are the families we need to organize to bring to that park? So then be like, we all here. This is our space too. So I love that story. I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm moved to know that, you know, that my thinking and question helps you to think and question your choices. And again, I don't feel like there's always a right way, right? Because liberation in that moment could have been like, I'm going to keep my child at home, right? I think what I do want to say is, I think folks have the freedom and the flexibility to determine what liberation is for themselves, right? And so I just want to flag that was also an option for you. And it feels important because our children deserve to be free. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with our children. There's nothing inherently that makes them less valuable, less important, less significant, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with them internally. It's all the systems and the institutions and the white supremacy and the racism and the sexism that exist in the world. That's the problem. I think once we can identify the problem, right? The issue is this system. The issue is this oppression. The issue is white supremacy. The issue is police brutality. The issue is racism. Like, when we can identify the actual systems or root causes of the issue and stop trying to fix our children, because there's nothing wrong with our children. I mean, typical young people stuff, typical toddler stuff, like, yes, but there's nothing inherently wrong with being a Black child, Black girl, Black boy, anything, right? Actually, there's something inherently worthy, valuable, right? Beautiful, powerful, bold about being Black in this country. Shoot, about being Black anywhere across the diaspora. And so I think what I tried to do with my children is, even in those instances where they may experience microaggressions or overt racism, or, you know, this racism that you explained on the playground, it's like, well, what is the work I'm doing with my child on a day-to-day basis to let them know about their inherent worth and their value and their beauty? And let them know that, like, there might be people who think otherwise, but let me tell you, you like a Black girl who are magical, you shine, you all that and some, right? Like, don't let nobody, right? Don't let nobody question you and make you feel like there's something wrong with you. If someone has a problem with you, that's their problem, right? And so I try to support that, because to me, that is connected to our sense of self, right? As a people. And I think in the past, our ancestors had to choose different paths, right? They chose to, like, ask us to, like, to mute ourselves, to lower ourselves, to put our heads down, to, like, not be too bright, to not shine too bright, to not be too bold, right? Like, don't rock the boat, slide under the radar, right? And that was the way to keep us protected. But I think if we do use that strategy, because that's still a strategy that people can choose, if you do use that strategy, I just encourage us to let our children know that it's not because there's something inherently wrong with them. Because I think at times our elders and ancestors, generations before us, told us to, like, be quiet, don't rock the boat. And we didn't know why. We thought that there was, like, okay, we're good, we're in trouble, we're the bad guys, or there's something wrong with us. And I thought, it's like, how do we encourage our babies to know of their value? How do we affirm them, right? And I think that is the reason it's important, because if we let our fear and our trauma parent us, or parent our children, it makes them question their sense of self. It makes them doubt themselves. It makes them more insecure. And then they end up doing things that we're like, why did you do that? Or why are you choosing that path? It's like, my whole life I've been thinking that there's something inherently unvaluable or unworthy about myself. So I think it's about encouraging their sense of self, their sense of pride, them loving themselves, them loving their skin, their hair, their ancestry, learning about that, learning about the history, how their people have fought and been resilient and revolutionary, And not only learning about it during Black History Month, learning about it every day, and letting that pride and that cultural grounding help them to resist in those moments, help them to resist in those moments of racism or inequity, whether it be on the playground or at school or, in workplaces. Like, how do we cultivate that in them early on?
Those words just mean so much. Like you said, I think a lot of us, well, we love our parents, and I think that there's ways that we can honor the way that we were parented and the way that our parents were parented. There's also ways to critique and to, find value in what may no longer serve us. I think it may be a simple question. I'm not 100% sure, but do you feel at all like parenting for liberation is a privilege? Do you feel like, I know we have a lot of conversations these days. We've talked about, Black people, we are a diaspora, we are very diverse. And we are also diverse in socioeconomic backgrounds or educational backgrounds or skin complexion. And there's been more conversations over the last few years about privilege. I wish I had the word privilege when I was younger to really be able to kind of flesh out differences. But when I think about privilege, do you all feel like parenting for liberation is something that comes from a place of privilege, or do you also see value and see examples of it being diverse?
That's a really great question. I'm so glad you posed it. It is not a simple one. But I would say that parenting for liberation is a way of being, right? It is a practice, it's a mindset shift. And I think anyone can shift their mind. Anyone can shift their mind state. I think it is accessible, right, to people. And I've, we've done the research and things of that nature, and socioeconomic status, educational background, to see who does this resonate with? And I will say it does resonate at times with folks who, I think the language that we use and choose, we have to make it more accessible. Even this idea of liberation, but I do think it is accessible to those who are in this place of questioning, I want to love on my children in a different way. I think anyone who has a child, right, who wants to be I want my child to be happy, joyful, caring, all of those things. I want them to be free. I don't want them to die from police violence. I want them to love themselves. All of those things are accessible regardless, right? I do programs with teen parents here in Los Angeles. And so it is accessible because this work really looks at how we were parented, right? We look back, you just said, how do we honor our parents and our elders? We spend time reflecting on our past, on our childhood, how we were raised. We look back and we assess, what of that do we want to keep? What of that do we want to let go? How do we say thank you, ancestors or elders or parents or grandparents? Thank you for your parenting that got us this far. Of that, this is what I'm going to keep because that will serve us. And of that, I'm going to let go of these things, right? I think that is generational, but that can happen in any family. Some of the most liberated parents I know are, single parents who are, maybe considered lower income because it's not about the resources you have. It's about the love and the care and the attention you give your children. Several of them are stay-at-home parents, or they aren't self-employed or unemployed or underemployed. When I think about some of the work I've been doing in partnership with Through the Night, it's a documentary that's actually streaming right now on PBS for free. It's a film about care workers, about a daycare center that's 24 hours, and a lot of the parents are all low wage workers who have to work multiple jobs, and so they have to send their child to this overnight daycare. And the film really just looks at, it looks at the holes in our economic system that don't support caregivers who have these minimum wage or low wage jobs. All that to say is all of those parents who are making that sacrifice to work 2 and 3 jobs and put their children in this daycare and this daycare provider, I look at them and I'm like, oh, they're all liberated parents and caregivers. And so when I think it's not it definitely, it has to be accessible. It has to be something that folks are really intentional about. And it does require, I will be transparent, I feel like parenting for liberation does require spaciousness. It does require you to pause and reflect. It does require you to slow down. And I do think that honestly, some folks who are working paycheck to paycheck, are working so many jobs, are overexhausted because they're in school and working and have multiple things to do, that it can feel like choosing to pause and reflect feels like a privilege. Like I can hear people saying like, I don't got time for that. I just need my kid to do what I say when I say it. I don't have time to talk. I don't have time to repeat myself. You know, I've heard parents say that I don't have time to like do it again. I don't have time to like, let's sit down and talk about your feeling. Like I've heard parents say that, right? So when I say what is the privilege of it, it requires some time. It requires some space, because it's not just going to be the easy, let me pop you to get you to sit down. It's like, no, we're not doing that. We're actually need to be in a conversation with our children and understand. And so I think it does take more time. So the privilege piece of it is folks who have that space and that time to actually work on this shift.
Yeah, I think like you said, it's definitely a mindset. I do think at times even individuals who may be in a place of privilege, you may not be in a place to have that mental space to really sit down and reflect. So I think you do have to be very intentional about it. I wanted to see if you could dive a little bit deeper into some examples of what parenting for liberation looks like, sounds like. There were two examples that I absolutely loved from the book that just really made me think about, you know, as my son gets older, things that I'm definitely going to take. So you talk about the letters that you write to your children's teachers, and how you express information about your child and how, you know, to best serve your child. You also talked about, what was the second example I was thinking of? That was one of the biggest ones that I can think of, where I was just like, ooh, I definitely, like, every one of my child's teachers is going to be getting a note like Paris is. And what was the other one? Oh, that I think is just speaks to parent involvement overall. Let's tackle that one first, because we work specifically with a lot of educators, and we're always hearing, you know, conversations about like parent involvement, and it seems like parent involvement in education and in the classroom is really important, as well as an aspect of parenting for liberation.
Well, yeah, it has been for me. So I think when we think about our children's liberation, right? One of the areas that we talk about is, you know, like you can raise your child for liberation in the home, and that's a safe space and they feel liberated, but then they're going to venture out into the world, right? Whether that be going to a public school or, you know, some type of institution, you know, just how do they navigate in those other spaces, and how do we make sure that those places are sites of liberation as well for our children, right? So I asked the question too, like, how can we make schools and educational spaces sites of liberation for our children, right? Whether that be the curriculum that they're learning, whether it be the relationships they have with their peers, whether that be, you know, the school dress code and the rules, like all of those things. Does the school have police on campus? Like those types of things really determine if the school site is a place of liberation or if it's a place of oppression. And so when I think about what's our role as parents, I think, you know, parents have an active role. They have PTAs for a reason. Parents have an active role, you know, in our children's education and well-being, and we have voice and agency in those spaces, right, in school spaces. And so, yeah, every year I send a letter to my son's school, to his teacher, and I basically inform them of who he is, right, and like who he is in all his greatness and all his glory and all his magic, right, and all his, you know, he's an empathetic young boy who, you know, loves blah, 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 right? So I try to explain who he is to give them context, right? Then I also let him know who he is so that they might not know, right? Because he goes into these schools where, you know, I think in the US predominantly, I want to say like a large percentage of teachers are white women, Like even in schools that are like run in community by Black folks or communities of color, like a large portion of teachers are white women. That's like the field that a lot of them enter. And so I'm like, hey, typically it's been a white woman. I'm like, hey, also I want you to know my child is Black. Have you noticed? Like, do you know and do you realize he's Black? And I said, if you don't realize he's Black and you think that this world is colorblind, then we have a huge problem. Here's some links, right? And I'm like, okay, so I'm trying to help them with cultural competency. I talk about I send them links to articles about, racism in the classroom. I send them links to articles about, white women's role in racism in the classroom. Like, I just give them all the details, and then I tell them who I am. I'm an active parent. I'm willing to volunteer. I will be here. I'm going to show up. I can show up for you. I can show up for the other students. I can support you with these different activities. So I offer myself as a resource. It also lets them know, to be honest, it also lets them know, like, okay, this parent is going to be watching. Okay. And I want them to know that I'm not only going to watch for my kid, because I think that's sometimes what we do. We only look out for our kid. I always tell them, when I'm supporting in your classroom and I'm bringing any tools or resources to your classroom, it's going to support all the children. And so that's what I do. And so I've gone in for Black History Month workshops. I've gone in for social justice workshops, Black Lives Matters workshops. I've gone in for when it's Indigenous history, when they're talking about Columbus and all that. I come in and be like, nope, there's a whole group of people who were here before. And let me tell you about that. And let me tell you the truth about Columbus, right? So I go in and I try to offer those tools and conversations for young people. Mind you, my kid's only in elementary. So this was happening in first grade and kindergarten. I was bringing books, it would be like the Read Across America thing. And the books that I would bring are like, let's talk about Ruby Bridges. Let's talk about, like these are the books. So those are the types of things and supports. And it helps to build a relationship. It also helps my child to feel like they have support in the classroom, even if I'm not there. So those are some of the ways that I've engaged. I will honor and acknowledge that again has a lot of privilege, that I can be active and because I work a job that allows me to go into the school, that allows me to take time to be there, right? I've had jobs before where I couldn't. And so I was doing a lot of emailing because I was working a job 9 to 5 that I couldn't really take off. So I will acknowledge that. But I do believe that there are ways to stay in relationship with our child's educators, because when I think about educators, I think about them also spending 6 to 8 hours with our children per day, right? So I'm like, okay, you need to be liberated too, because this is what we're teaching at home. And it's been interesting because teachers have said the way that Terrence communicates, for example, we have a dialogue in our household where it's like, well, what do you think? And we can have an exchange. And there's times where the teacher's like, oh, he didn't raise his hand. And I said, that's not natural to him. That's not the way that we engage in a conversation, And so she's like, she keeps shushing him because he's not raising his hand, this rule. And I'm like, what's the significance of raising your hand? Why do we do that? So then I'm like, I want her to think about it. Is that a mindset shift that she can make? Is that a shift that can happen in this classroom? So I also think about encouraging them to liberate themselves as educators, liberating themselves from the structures of test scores and check boxes, right? Everybody can be liberated, not just parents. And so sometimes I'm over there supporting the teachers in their own liberation from systemic oppression of institutions such as educational systems. So it's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of work. And I like to acknowledge when we really do get to a place of liberation, we won't have to do all that work because everyone will be thinking about the liberation of our children. But until then, that's the work that we do.
Thank you so much. Like I said, every one of my child's teachers will be getting a note for the remainder of his life. I may be sending them in college.
Even in college.
I've already got it
figured out. They got their letter down. Hopefully they get the letter down. Ma, I got it. Let me tell him who I am.
He'd be like, I'm gonna send it to his boss. When he starts work, I just want you to know that.
No, it's gonna be it's like their version of their cover letter, right? When they apply or when they, let me tell you about who I am. I am a liberated being, right? I just feel like that's where we're gonna get to, right? They're gonna be like, allow me to reintroduce myself.
Exactly. But like you said, I think there's conscious bias and there's unconscious bias. And what we see a lot in the classroom is teachers they have conscious bias, but they also have unconscious bias. So as soon as they see, a certain name, they see a young boy, are they thinking ADD? Are they thinking ADHD? Are they thinking prison? Like, I don't know. And I think that the letter kind of, it can, I don't want to say it controls, but it provides, like you said, that introduction. Like, I want you to know who my child is, so you have an idea of who he is as a person, who he is as a young man, before you're able to make any assumptions about who he is, but also that there is an advocate behind him. Like, research has shown, especially when it comes to young Black children, even in the classroom, but also in law enforcement interactions, knowing that they have an advocate, knowing that someone is looking out for them, changes the way that other adults interact with them, because they know that they are going to be held accountable. So, like I said, these are going to be things that are definitely happening for my son. So we will definitely leave some time for questions, but I did want to ask, everyone always wants to quote, 2020, 2020, 2020. We hear that all the time. And I guess I will ask, based on things that we saw, the heightened racial tension in 2020, but also the more visible interactions with law enforcement, and specifically young Black men, but also young Black girls. So young Black youth as a whole, how does that fit into this? Can you talk a little bit about kind of specifics as it pertains to interactions with law enforcement and educating young Black children about interactions with law enforcement, but also any ways that you see Parenting for Liberation changing or evolving since the things that have happened, or how it's more important even now?
Those are good questions. I will say, like, we talked about the pandemic as the dual pandemics of like COVID and racism and police brutality and all of and white supremacy, and how all of those are happening simultaneously for us as Black folks. And what I saw was that because we were all together in our homes, right, everywhere, everyone, that it was hard to really turn off, right, and disconnect, because like it's just on the news all the time, right, all day. And so I know a lot of parents who may have turned off the TV and not talked about it with their children were kind of compelled and forced to talk about it, because it was on every channel, it was on every YouTube, it probably was coming up on their TikTok feeds, who knows, right? So kids were seeing it more than they did before, right? Even the young ones, the little ones were like, okay, everyone knew George Floyd's name, right? So I think it became much more, you couldn't hide it from your children, you couldn't protect your children from it, it was in their face, right? We had to have the conversation. So I saw a lot more people having the conversation. I think a lot of organizations, a lot of people talk about how to have the talk with your child about how to engage with the police. I have not like written anything like that, like this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do, because I feel like I said, a lot of organizations, a lot of people have written that. In the book, what we talk about when we talk about police violence, we talk about like when we talk to our kids about it, how do we talk about it that centers the humanity of the person whose lives was taken, right? And not focus so much on like the police and the violence, right? We try to honor their lives. And we honor their lives, and we also try to spend time reflecting on that their life was inherently worthy and there was nothing that they did wrong that led them to die. Because I think a lot of times there's a lot of victim blaming that goes on, right? Well, what was he doing? What was he wearing? Where was she? I think about Ma'Khia Bryant. What was she doing? Why did she have that? Well, like as if people deserve to be killed and murdered by those who are sworn in to protect and serve us, right? When we call for help, we end up being the victims. That is what we spend time honoring, right? That their life was inherently valuable, and that there's nothing wrong with them that led to their demise, right? And we talk about this issue, we talk about racism, we talk about the history of the police. Like, my children know that the police actually came out of the slave patrol, that they were like, their original role in society was to catch Black people who were running away from their enslavement. And so if that's their origin story, then what do you think their job is, right? They're supposed to protect and serve all of us, but what are they serving to protect? It's not Black people, it's property, it's white people's interest, it's money, right? It's certain communities and neighborhoods. They're protecting those things, and they see us as potentially threats to those things that they want to protect, right? And so I try to hold it in that context. I mean, I know it's probably a little bit too much for my kids, but I just want them to always know and understand the whole system, right? That there's a whole system and institution behind it. And I see parenting differently because so many people went out to protest, so many people went out and were active, so many people went out. Like, the summer of protests and uprisings and speaking out against this violence and this assault was like so much. It was like, even my kid came to a protest. We were just driving down the street and we saw one. We just pulled over, like, oh, this one happened in Orange County, and we live in Orange County, the suburbs of California. So all of that to say is, like, everyone was talking about it. So it was definitely a time to be able to get active, to talk about justice, to talk about equity, to talk about police violence. And then there was this huge conversation about abolition. There was this huge conversation about defunding the police. There was this huge conversation about, like, what else could be possible. And there was a chapter in the book that was with Cecilia Caballero, who had talked to her son. It was a murder, a similar situation. The police had, reared his ugly head, and police violence and state violence was, like, literally down the street from her house, and she couldn't hide it from her kid because there were all these police. So he's like, Mom, what happened down the street? So she had to tell him what happened, right? She didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't give all the details, but she's like, the police shot someone, and so he's like, well, why did he shoot them? And so then he wanted to write a letter to the police. He was like 6 years old. So she wrote the letter, like, he said it and she wrote it. And so that conversation was also an example of, like, liberation, right? We can have the conversation with our children that's not about, when you see the police do this, stop, freeze, all of those things. Like, yes, those are incredible, like, harm reduction strategies. And in this conversation with her son, it was really about, what do you see as the problem here? And what do you think is a potential solution? And her 5-year-old, had this, like, whole solution about, like, police throwing their guns in the trash can, and that we don't need the police to, like, be in our community. We need our community to support each other. It was just beautiful that he was, like, 5 years old, and he was, like, basically saying, and this was, like, in 2015, he was basically giving an example of, like, us defunding the police and police abolition, but in this beautiful, like, little story that a little 5-year-old would tell about dinosaurs and science centers and all of those kinds of things. So I think what's different now is that we can have the conversations with our children about police in ways that are not about, protection, but other in ways that are about liberation. And so I think that's been beautiful.
Thank you so much. I literally was, like, freaking out every chapter that I read. There wasn't even, like, one chapter that I was like, this is better than the others. It just all kind of blew my mind. And you spoke about two things just now that were another part of kind of really shifting my thought processes around parenting. One, we think of interactions with the police, but we also think of things like the sex talk as one talk. And when you start to highlight that, like, that is not one talk, that it is a series of talks, and that you look for these little opportunities, like, that blew my mind, because I was like, oh my God, I don't even have to, like, freak out anymore about having to talk to my son about sex one day. Like, this is something that we will start periodically, so you understand your body, you understand other people's bodies, you understand consent. Like, it is not something I have to freak out about to have this one huge monstrous talk with my child, that it's something that I can do over a period of time.
This huge lecture, no, if your child takes so long to learn the ABCs and their colors, why do we think that we're gonna get sex in one conversation?
Because we call it the talk. So we're like,
that one talk.
Which I, like, blew my mind. I was like, that makes sense.
And look, I'm a grown woman and I still learn new things about sex to this day. to this day. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I didn't know. What's that? I didn't know what that was called. I never knew that you could do that. Huh. You know, like you just learning all kinds of things about bodies and anatomies, and even as an adult, right? And so I feel like me and my mom used to always say, I'm a lifelong learner. And so I'm like, yes, we are all lifelong learners. Then why did we think we were going to learn everything we needed to know about sex in like the 6th grade sex ed class, or are we going to learn everything we needed to learn? And so, yeah, those conversations should happen early. Yeah, like your kid's 18, 19 months, like I'm sure he already knows all the different, like the differences. He's noticing the differences between, you know, female bodies and male bodies and the biology and anatomy. So like you can start talking about some of that stuff. And please, 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 as a person who is a survivor of child sexual abuse, like please talk to your children early about sex. Please talk to your children early about sexual violence and their bodies and safety and consent. Because that is the only way to prevent it, is to talk about it. I think parents think like, if I talk about sex, my kids are going to want to have sex. If I talk about if I talk about it, then they're going to want to do it, or it's going to happen. And it's like, no, the only way to prevent child sexual abuse and molestation and all of those things with our community, and please know that Black girls have experience high rates of that violence, because we don't talk about it enough. And when it does happen, and when the girls do bring it up in our communities at times, we may go like, oh, that's not what happened. You know, we don't believe their story. So believe them, listen to them, and talk about it. I think that's the best way to prevent any harm, is to know what the harm is, to know what our body parts are, to call our body parts as young as 18 months, right? That this is a vagina, and this is a penis, and these are testicles, and these are breasts, right? Like actually name the thing, and not some random nickname like wee and pokey. And
thank you. Yeah, that's such a beautiful reminder. And I think, like you said, something to start early. You know, there's so much to go into parenting. So, you know, just feeling more comfortable about some of those more difficult conversations. And again, the S on that, conversations, is important. And before we switch it over to questions, I have one more, because I think it's really important. And you talked about this in your last prompt. What do you see children or, you know, youth involvement in Parenting for Liberation and just anti-racism and activism work? I think that that's one of the biggest things that is missing from history books, is the involvement of Black women, but also of children in the civil rights movement specifically. And I think that your book does such an amazing job of really highlighting the history, but also highlighting ways that youth, such as the letter, such as helping your child start to do that anti-racism and that activism work at a young age, how important that is.
Yeah, I mean, you just said it already. I think you asked the question and you answered it. Like, knowing the history of movements. Many movements are like led by young people. Like when we think about the movement right now, I hear, it's so interesting. I hear elders or folks not even that much older than me often saying like, you know, the youth of this generation are really, you know, they're making the change. Like, we're really proud of the young people. You know, they're really out there in the streets, they're protesting, they're fighting for justice, they're on the front lines. Like, the elders are like super proud of the young people in this generation. And I'm like, it's always been the young people. Like, this is the way that movements have worked, right? Young people have been the voice, the face. When I think about, you know, SNCC, and I think about all the student organizers at schools. When I think about me, how I even got involved in activism, it was when I was a student on campus, and like, you know, doing lock-ins and locking ourselves up in the admissions office because there weren't enough Black students being admitted to University of California, Los Angeles, right? And so when I think about it, I think about the power of young people to see. I think young people can see the inherent, the obvious inequities and injustices because they're not so tied. They're not so tied to the system, right? Like, as adults, you know, we kind of get sucked into the system or the rat race, you know, go to work, pay our bills. Like, we're focused on all the things we're responsible for. And sometimes we don't see like, oh, it's unfair, unjust, or inequitable, because we're just like, we got to pay our bills. We got to get our kids, you know, we're just living our lives, trying to the best of our abilities. We don't have time to see all these flaws because we just got to get it done. But young people are like, this is not fair. You know, ask a 2-year-old about fairness and sharing, and they'll tell you when stuff is not fair. And so their commitment to fairness and justice, and having that sense of like something's not right here, and not being so tied to the capitalist, system, they ask a lot of questions. That's what they do. They're in the learning space. And so I think young people, because they have a sense of questioning, a sense of like fairness, that pushes them to want to challenge things, right? That's also what they're doing in their tweens and teens, is challenging authority. And so I'm like, let them utilize all that energy against oppression and systems, and not try to be up in the house doing that. Like, yeah, go out and fight something else, not your mama. That was my quick way of saying that. But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, so the last panel that we had for the day was right before this, and it was on femme activism, and it had like all these young women that I'm in my 30s, and I'm like fangirling over like 18-year-olds like in these streets, like doing the work. And so that recording will be available as well. Like Zy Bryant, who's in Charlottesville, Virginia, she was one of the main activists during the issues. I went to University of Virginia, so I'm gonna call it the massacre that happened at Charlottesville. She was one of the main advocates that was on the front line of really advocating for Black people in Charlottesville, the students, the removal of many Civil War statues that we have in Charlottesville, Virginia. I mean, even me as a UVA alum, now in my 30s, having to reconcile with going to this institution that just stands over, Thomas Jefferson in such a way, and learning more and more about the history in which he was involved. I'm like, yo, they need to, we have some reconciling to do still in this country, and within a lot of systems and institutions as well. So I digress there. So we have about 7 more minutes. We can go over a little bit as well. We've been going over like 5 minutes max, but if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat or the questions box. You can also raise your hands and I can unmute you and you can ask your question if you would like. I have plenty of more questions, so I'm gonna give you guys the floor for a little bit, but if you guys don't have some questions, I will dive into some more questions that I have. I'm gonna wait a minute, see if anyone has some questions. This is such a beautiful conversation. Thank you again, Trina.
Thank you, and thank you. I appreciate you reading the book and having such great insights. A lot of times I will say, I wrote this book, my son at the time was 10, my bonus daughter at the time was 15. And I often say this book is for, because I parent full-time, my kiddos, my son. I was like, I don't know if this book is actually gonna, there definitely has to be a part 2 of this book that's for the more older age young people, like teenagers and young adults, and what does it mean to liberate them? And I think they should have an active role in writing that. So I'll be working on that version of the book.
Yes, I cannot wait. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and ask. I have 2 more questions for you, if that works. How can parents attend to their inner child?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part. We talked about a mindset shift, right? How do we get to the space where we can shift our minds is actually to be attentive to ourselves and our own worries, concerns, fears. And some of that is looking at our own inner child, right? How we talked about looking back at how we were parented. And then at times that may require us to reparent ourselves. And we can do that. We can reparent our inner child. Sometimes our child didn't get love or support, or didn't get the, you're okay, you got this, or the encouragement. And so we can do that for ourselves. We can affirm ourselves. And so Parents for Liberation spends a lot of time doing self-care, community care for Black parents specifically, because, at times we need that space to take care of ourselves. Because if we don't take care of ourselves as parents, then we can't show up our best selves for our children. You feel me? So I definitely believe that our inner child is so important. So doing that work to understand how trauma may have impacted us as children, doing that work, whether that be, and like that healing work can be, the traditional westernized ways of going to therapy, or it could be all this range of like, there's so many different healing practices. There's affirmation practices, there's Reiki practices, there's connecting to our ancestors practice. There's so many practices. And so Parenting for Liberation really tries to offer a variety of healing circles and self-care workshops for Black parents to just have that space to be like, let me take care of me, let me connect myself to me and my heart. And so I definitely think it's important because all of us didn't get parented from a liberated way. And so we may have to, in order for us to be liberated parents, we may have to liberate ourselves first.
Yeah, this came up in one of our other chats, multiple of our chats on adultification, because that comes up quite often when we're talking about young Black girls. And, I have to admit, like when I was younger, my mom would not let me wear certain things. And I was always like, oh, why would you not let me wear my mini skirt? Or like, she would even hide them in the dryer at times. She would like hide my skirts in the dryer so I like wouldn't know where they were. And looking back on it, I'm like, she was parenting the best that she could. She was afraid of how others were going to interact with me, how others were going to see my body, how others were going to treat me. And those were conversations that she didn't necessarily, I'm guessing, feel comfortable having with me. But to a child, that looks confusing. That looks like, someone just putting their foot down and being like, no, you can't have this. But now that I'm an adult, I'm able to see it differently and think, okay, this was actually her parenting, maybe from a place of not addressing her inner child, of, at times, like, I don't know a Black woman or a Black girl who has not gone through some form of adultification in some aspect. So, these are the things that we have to address as adults, to think back on our experiences. And I really took that from your book so that we can think about how we can be more insightful or how we can be more intentional about those conversations with our young people. I will say, I put in the chat, I am going to send anyone who wants a free copy of Trina's book. We will send you a copy. I will get with Trina. We will either, get them straight from her. We'll get it from Jeff Bezos. We will figure out the best way to get you guys a copy of the book. If you send me your mailing address to my email address, that's my direct email address, we all got a Parent for Liberation. So send me your address and we will get you a copy of the book. Last question I have for you. Do you see Parenting for Liberation different for Black girls versus Black boys?
Ooh. I definitely see their liberation as tied. I definitely see, I will say, right, as a Black feminist, that their liberation is tied, and Black women always show up for Black men. And Black girls and Black women always show up for Black boys and Black men. And I would say the way that our liberation is different is that though Black women and girls have been at the forefront and the leaders of all these movements for our lives, that were often negated, pushed to the side, and not lifted up. And we don't receive the same level of support from our Black men and brothers and from the community, period. And so I think our liberation is definitely tied. And I think that when we say Black Lives Matter, we believe that all Black lives matter, including Black women and girls and femmes and gender nonconforming and trans, right? But unfortunately, as Malcolm X said, the most disrespected person in America is a Black woman. And I would say and through that vein, Black girls. And I would say liberation for Black girls, it's going to require a lot more of parents to see girls, right? Because of the impact of both racism and sexism, right? Because of the impact of misogyny and racism, misogynoir, right? When those things come together, like Black women, Black girls are at the intersection of so much violence and oppression. And so I would say that though our liberation is tied, and I do think that liberating our children is the, we need to be working to liberate our children. We need to be paying a lot of attention to the way that Black girls are negated and are seen as okay, right? And adultified in different ways and made responsible for things in ways that boys aren't. There's this saying that I've heard that I've been trying to resist, is that that in our community, and I don't believe this, but this is what people have said, is that we raise our girls and we love our boys. And I would say it's time for us to stop just raising our girls, right? Making them responsible, raising them, but without the love and the support. That we need to love our girls as much as we love our boys. They are just as sacred. And I think I'll even speak to that, like I'm responsible for that in my own way, right? I spend a lot of time talking about my son because he's my biological child, and I have a different level of like oversight of him, right? And I try to honor my bonus daughter's biological mom and honor her parenting and honor who she is in her life. And so I try to do that in a way that doesn't, disrespect her mother. But I do acknowledge that even when I talk about my work and I talk about my children, that I spend a lot of time talking about my son. And so I honor that. And I do, I do believe that we have to do better for Black girls. Their liberation is vital because Black girls and Black women, are the life force of our community, are the life force of
magic. We're magic.
We are magic, right? And so, we need people to honor our magic and to reciprocate it back to us. And the amount of love and sacrifice and unconditional love that Black women have for our people, we need that same love reciprocated back to us. So that is my commitment. That's why I do the work and that I do with and for Black women and girls as a Black feminist, because our lives depend on it. All of our lives depend on Black women and girls thriving and surviving.
Normally I ask for like parting words of wisdom, but I think that was it right there. That was it right there. Like that was the wisdom that was the parting wisdom we needed, because Black girls, one, we have to create more sisterhood and support, more safe spaces such as this, find more advocates such as yourself where we can honor your work. We can find examples within your work. I can't thank you enough for being here, for creating space with us, helping us create this unique experience where we're not just focusing on the mental health and well-being of young girls, but also women, and honoring the parent and the caregiver experience as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for your support, and thank you for thinking not only about the young girls but thinking about their parents, because that's a super important role in Black girls' lives. So thank you so much.